He existed in the space between things. Not quite in the conversation, but not entirely out of it. At his desk, which was nestled in a quiet corner of the open-plan office, he was a part of the furniture like the gray filing cabinet or the humming water cooler. His name was Arthur, and if anyone ever thought of him, it was usually as Arthur from Data. He was the man you went to when a spreadsheet went wrong, when a decimal point had mysteriously wandered off and hidden itself in a sea of numbers. He was reliable, quiet, and about as exciting as a well-organized file folder. His colleagues, a vibrant collection of people in their 20s and 30s, didn't dislike him. They barely saw him. They saw his sensible shoes, his neatly parted hair, the way he always brought a sandwich in a plastic container. They knew he played the piano, a fact they treated like a quaint, harmless oddity, like being able to fold a fitted sheet perfectly. "Hey, Art, gonna serenade the Q3 earnings report for us?" A young man from marketing would call out, chuckling as he walked past. Arthur would just offer a small, tight smile and nod, the joke landing with the same dull thud it always did. Their laughter wasn't mean. It was casual, which in some ways was worse. It was the laughter of people who were so secure in their world that they couldn't imagine anyone feeling differently in theirs. The workday would end, and he would make the same journey home, a ghost on the crowded train. He'd walk through the door of his small, comfortable house, and the feeling of being slightly out of focus would follow him. His wife would be there, her face lighting up in a way that was genuine and loving, yet also tinged with a familiar, gentle worry. She'd ask about his day, and he'd give the same answer he always did. Fine, busy. They would eat dinner, and the conversation would circle around practical things, the leaky faucet, the rising cost of groceries, the new savings plan their financial advisor had recommended for their retirement. Her love for him was as solid as the ground beneath their feet, but it was a practical love. It was built on security, on plans, on the quiet, predictable life they had built together. And in that life, the sleek, black baby grand piano that dominated their living room was a problem. It was a beautiful, expensive monument to a past she couldn't quite understand and a future she was afraid of. It had been a gift to himself years ago, a splurge after a promotion, a desperate attempt to hold on to the boy who once dreamed of concert halls. Now, it just collected dust and reminded her of the money sitting idle. "Arthur," she said one evening, polishing the smooth, glossy wood with a soft cloth, "did you ever think about, I don't know, selling this? We could put the money into the retirement fund. Or we could finally take that trip to the coast we always talk about." She said it gently, but the words still landed like a small stone in his stomach. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was trying to help him, to pull him back into the safe, practical world where dreams were things you had on vacation, not things you pursued in your own living room. He looked at the piano, at the reflection of his own tired face in the black lacquer. "I don't think so," he said softly. "Not yet?" She sighed, a small sound of resignation, and let the subject drop. But it was always there, hovering between them, the unspoken question of what he was holding on for. Sometimes his daughter would call from college. Her voice was bright and full of a world that was just opening up to her. "Hi, Dad. How's it going? Still tinkering with that old piano?" She'd ask, her tone affectionate and dismissive all at once. "You should write a hit song? You could be famous." He could hear the smile in her voice, but he also knew she saw it as a cute little hobby, like building model ships or collecting stamps. She didn't understand that when he sat at that piano, he wasn't just tinkering. He was fighting a battle. He was trying to give a voice to the man nobody saw. He would mumble something non-committal and change the subject, asking about her classes, her friends, her new life. He was so proud of her, but talking to her also made him feel the distance between their worlds more acutely. She was launching, while he felt like he was tethered to the ground, held down by years of routine and expectation. So he learned to live in the quiet moments. He learned that his real life didn't happen in the office or even at the dinner table. It happened late at night, when the house was asleep and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. After his wife had gone to bed, he would slip out of their room, closing the door softly behind him. He would walk into the living room, a shadow moving through the darkness, and sit on the bench before the piano. He wouldn't turn on the big light, just a small lamp in the corner, casting a warm, golden glow on the keys. This was his sanctuary. This was the only place where the invisible man became visible. He would rest his fingers on the cool ivory, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of them. And then he would begin to play. He didn't play the simple tunes his colleagues might expect. He played complex, haunting melodies that he had been composing for years, piece by piece, in the stolen moments of his life. The music was full of a longing and a passion that he kept locked away inside him during the day. It was the sound of his frustration, his quiet hopes, the ache of being misunderstood. With the door closed, the sound was muffled, a secret being told to the walls. But in that small, lamplit room, as his fingers danced across the keys, Arthur Penelagon wasn't Arthur from Data, he was just Arthur. And for a little while, that was more than enough. The announcement came during a Monday morning team meeting, a weekly ritual that usually involves staring at a projector screen while someone droned on about quarterly projections. But this time was different. The head of the organizing committee, a woman from HR with a voice that was always a little too cheerful, stood up and clapped her hands together. All right, everyone. As you know, our annual charity gala is just 3 weeks away, and this year we're doing something new. We're having a talent show. A ripple of mixed groans and excited murmurs went through the room. She continued, her smile unwavering. We need acts. Singers, dancers, magicians, anything you've got. Sign-up sheet is on the board in the break room. Let's show everyone what the Sterling and Finch family can do. A few people immediately started buzzing with ideas. A loud, confident salesman from the marketing department, a man who always seemed to be performing even when he was just buying coffee, declared he was going to do a stand-up routine. A few people laughed, already picturing it. Arthur sat in his usual chair at the back of the room, half listening, his mind already on the spreadsheets waiting for him. He was a ghost in these meetings, a silent observer. He had no talent to share, not the kind that could be put on a stage. Then, his boss, Mr. Davies, a man with a perpetually worried expression and a comb-over, spoke up. He was trying to be helpful, but his help often felt like a weight. That's a wonderful idea, he said, his voice carrying that familiar, slightly condescending tone. We'll need some ambiance, you know. Something to settle the crowd before the real entertainment starts. Some nice, quiet background music. His eyes scanned the room, and for a brief, terrifying moment, they landed on Arthur. It was an impulse. A completely alien, un-Arthur-like impulse. It was as if a stranger had taken control of his hand. He felt a surge of something hot and defiant rise up from his chest, a protest against the word background. Before he could stop himself, his hand was in the air. The room, which had been buzzing with chatter, fell quiet. All eyes turned to him. Mr. Davies looked surprised, as if he'd forgotten Arthur was even in the room. Yes, Arthur? The boss asked, his brow furrowed. Arthur's mouth felt dry. He could feel 100 pairs of eyes on him, and his heart started to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He swallowed hard, and the words came out, much quieter than he intended, but they came out nonetheless. I can play the piano. For a second there was just silence. Then a few snickers started like kindling catching fire. The young salesman from marketing let out a loud, theatrical "oh," and nudged the person next to him. Mr. Davies's face broke into a wide, patronizing smile. He clapped his hands together once, a sharp, decisive sound. Wonderful, splendid. Arthur from Data, everyone. That's just perfect. He made a note on his clipboard, not even looking at Arthur. We'll slot you in first. To get everyone settled. The meeting moved on, but Arthur was no longer listening. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He hadn't been brave. He had just given them all a new reason to laugh. He had handed them the punchline to a joke he didn't understand. He had wanted to be seen, but not like this. Not as a curiosity, a quaint little opening act. The news spread through the office with the speed of a juicy piece of gossip. For the next week, his life became a series of small, stinging humiliations. At the coffee machine, a young woman he barely knew patted him on the arm. Heard you're our star performer, Arthur. You should play something, relaxing. She winked. Another time, he came back from lunch to find a piece of paper on his desk. On it, someone had drawn a crude picture of a piano with the words chopsticks written in big, bubbly letters. He quickly crumpled it up and shoved it in his pocket, his face burning with a shame so deep it felt physical. Even his boss got in on it. "Hey, Art, practicing your concertos?" He'd call out as he passed Arthur's desk, a grin plastered on his face. Don't want to disappoint the adoring fans. The word fans was delivered with a heavy dose of sarcasm that made everyone within earshot chuckle. Arthur would just nod, his eyes fixed on his computer screen, wishing he could disappear into the glowing numbers and columns. The worst part was telling his wife. That evening, he sat at the dinner table, pushing his food around his plate. The words felt heavy in his mouth. I signed up to play at the company gala, he mumbled. She stopped eating, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and deep, familiar concern. "Oh, Arthur, why?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Honey, you know what those people are like? They're just going to make fun of you." "I know," he said, staring at his plate. "I don't know why I did it. It was stupid." "No, it's not stupid," she said quickly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "But I worry about you. I don't want to see you get hurt." Her words were kind, but they felt like another confirmation of his own fears. She saw him the same way they did, as someone fragile, someone who needed to be protected from the world, not someone who could stand on a stage and command it. He felt that familiar wave of loneliness wash over him, the feeling that no one, not even the person who loved him most, truly understood the quiet battle raging inside him. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, replaying every snicker, every condescending pat on the back. He felt the full weight of his own foolishness. He should have just kept his head down like he always did. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up trying to sleep. He slipped out of bed and walked into the living room. The moonlight casting long shadows across the floor, he sat down at the piano. He lifted the fallboard, revealing the smooth ivory keys. For a moment, he just sat there, his fingers hovering. He thought about playing something simple, something safe, a gentle sonata by Mozart, a quiet piece by Debussy, something that would be nice background music, something that would prove them right. But then he felt a different kind of spark. It was small, but it was there, glowing in the darkness. It was the same spark that had made him raise his hand in the meeting. He thought about the crumpled drawing in his trash can. He thought about his boss's smug grin. He thought about the pity in his wife's eyes. And the slow, quiet resolve began to harden inside him. He was not going to play it safe. He was not going to be their background music. He was going to play his own music. The complex, passionate, sometimes dissonant melodies he had been pouring his soul into for years. The music that was a secret map to the man he was inside. They wanted a show? He would give them a show. They wanted a joke? He would play something so real, so honest, it wouldn't even be funny. It would be a statement. He placed his fingers on the keys, and for the first time, he wasn't playing to escape. He was playing to prepare. The first notes that filled the silent house were not soft or gentle. They were bold and clear, filled with a quiet, unshakable defiance. He was still scared. But for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't just going to let things happen to him. He was going to make something happen. That tiny spark of defiance that had ignited in the darkness of his living room was not a flash in the pan. It was the beginning of a slow, steady burn. For the first few days, he went about his routine as usual. He sat at his desk, corrected spreadsheets, and nodded along to conversations he wasn't a part of. But something was different. The snickers and the jokes no longer landed with the same painful thud. They were just noise, distant static. His mind was elsewhere, already at the piano, planning his next move. He wasn't just going to play. He was going to speak. And his language would be music. The question was, what would he say? He couldn't just play a random collection of angry chords. That would be childish. It needed to be a story. It needed to be his story. He thought about the pieces he had been composing in secret for years, little fragments of melody stored away in his mind and in a worn, leather-bound notebook. He sifted through them, not as a musician, but as an archaeologist digging through his own life. He found a piece he had started years ago, a piece he had never finished. It was a complex tapestry of sound, and he suddenly knew it was the only thing he could play. He gave it a name in his mind: Fading Echoes. It had 3 distinct parts. The first was a bright, hopeful melody, full of the promise of youth, a direct echo of the boy who once dreamed of concert halls and had a scholarship to a real conservatory. The second part was longer, more repetitive and melancholic. It was the sound of his daily life, the rhythmic clacking of a keyboard, the monotonous hum of the office, the polite, empty smiles. It was the sound of a man becoming a ghost. But the third part, the ending, was something he had only recently added. It was a powerful, rising crescendo, a defiant roar against the quiet sadness. It was the sound of the man who had raised his hand in a meeting and decided he was done being invisible, with his chosen weapon in mind, his practice transformed. It was no longer a late-night escape. It was a mission. Every night after his wife went to bed, he would slip into the living room. But this time, he didn't just turn on the small lamp. He flicked on the main light, bathing the piano in a bright, unforgiving glare. He needed to see everything, every key, every finger movement. He needed to be fully present. His body protested at first. His fingers, which had been typing on a keyboard for 20 years, were stiff and clumsy. They would cramp up, and the muscles in his forearms would burn with a dull ache. He would hit wrong notes, jarring, ugly sounds that would make him wince. In the past, this frustration would have made him give up for the night. But now, it just made him more determined. He would slow down, playing a difficult passage over and over, sometimes 100 times, until his fingers remembered the path as if by instinct. He wasn't just learning the notes. He was embedding the emotion into his very muscles. He poured his life into the keys. When he played the hopeful opening, he closed his eyes and saw himself as a teenager, full of a fire he thought had long been extinguished. When he transitioned into the melancholic middle section, he saw the faces of his colleagues, heard their laughter, felt the familiar weight of being overlooked. He played the monotony with such precision that it was no longer boring. It was tragic. He was telling the story of 1,000 small deaths, the death of ambition, the death of passion, the death of self. And then he would arrive at the crescendo. This was the hardest part, not just technically, but emotionally. It required a release he wasn't used to. He had to let go of all the quiet frustration, all the years of holding his tongue, all the unspoken dreams. At first, the sound was forced, loud but empty. But night after night, he chipped away at his own reserve. He started to feel the music not just in his fingers, but in his chest, in his gut. The powerful chords began to feel less like an explosion and more like a deep, cleansing breath. It was the sound of a man finally finding his own voice. His wife noticed the change. The soft, muffled music she was used to hearing through the door was gone. Now the sound was louder, more intense, sometimes lasting for hours. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was an event. One night, around midnight, she walked into the living room. He was so lost in the music he didn't hear her. She stood in the doorway, watching him. He was leaning over the keys, his face slick with sweat, his eyes closed in concentration. His hands moved with a power and a grace she had never seen in him before. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was wrestling with it, and he was winning. It was both beautiful and frightening to watch. When he finished the piece, the final chord hanging in the air, he opened his eyes and saw her standing there. He jumped, startled. "Oh, I didn't hear you." She walked slowly into the room, her arms crossed over her chest. "Arthur, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice quiet but tight with worry. "This isn't like you. It's too much." He just looked at her, his chest still heaving from the effort. "People are going to laugh," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "You know they are. You're going to get up there in front of everyone and play this angry music, and they're going to think you've lost your mind. Why are you doing this to yourself? To us?" Her words were like a splash of cold water. They brought back all the old fears, all the shame. For a moment, he felt the old Arthur, the one who wanted to apologize and retreat, re-emerge. But then he looked at his hands, resting on the keys. He looked at the worn notebook of composition sitting on the stand. He thought of the crumpled drawing of chopsticks in his trash can. He took a deep breath. They might, he said, his voice surprisingly calm and steady. They might laugh. They might think I've lost my mind. He looked up at her, meeting her gaze directly for the first time in a long time. But I'm not playing for them. Not anymore. She stared at him, her eyes wide. She didn't understand. She saw only the risk, the potential for humiliation. But he saw something else. He saw a chance to finally play the music that was in his heart, regardless of who was listening. He was no longer practicing to impress them or to prove them wrong. He was practicing to be true to the man he had been hiding for so long. After she went back to bed, he didn't feel defeated. He felt liberated. He played the piece one more time, and it was the best he had ever played it. The music flowed through him, no longer a struggle, but a conversation. He was no longer just a man playing a piano. He was a composer, an artist, a storyteller. And in the quiet, brightly lit living room, in the dead of night, Arthur Penelegon, the invisible man from Data, was finally, truly, being heard. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that felt like a promise. For Arthur, it felt like a judgment day. He stood in front of the mirror in his one slightly too tight suit, a suit he usually only wore for weddings and funerals. He looked at his reflection and saw the same man he always saw, the sensible hair, the tired eyes, the plain face. But underneath the surface, something was different. A current of nervous energy ran through him, a frantic hum that was almost musical. He had practiced until his fingers bled, not literally, but he had pushed them to their limits every single night. He knew fading echoes better than he knew his own name. He could play it in his sleep. But playing it for an empty room was one thing. Playing it for a room full of people who saw him as a joke was something else entirely. His wife helped him with his tie, her hands gentle but her expression etched with worry. "Are you sure about this, Arthur?" She asked for the 10th time that day. He looked at her, and instead of his usual mumble, he gave a small, firm nod. "Unsure." She didn't say anything else, just straightened his collar and gave him a small, sad smile. He knew she was coming to support him, but he also knew she was preparing herself for the worst. She was bracing for the humiliation she was so certain was coming. The hotel ballroom was a sea of shimmering dresses and dark suits. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the sound of clinking glasses and loud, overlapping conversations. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow on the crowd. Arthur felt like a drop of water in a vast, glittering ocean. He and his wife found a table near the back, a good place to be invisible until it was his time to be seen. He barely touched the fancy appetizers or the champagne. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, and every swallow felt like sandpaper. He watched the real entertainment get ready. The marketing salesman was backstage, pacing back and forth, rehearsing his jokes in a loud whisper. A group from HR was tuning their guitars, laughing and joking. They were performers. They belonged here. He felt like an imposter, a data analyst who had wandered into the wrong party. Then, a man with a microphone stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. "Good evening, everyone," he boomed, his voice barely cutting through the din. "Welcome to the Sterling and Finch Annual Charity Gala. We have a wonderful show for you tonight. But first, to get us started, we have a very special treat. Please welcome our very own Arthur Penelegon from Data Analysis." The announcement was met with a smattering of polite, pitying claps. A few people looked around, trying to spot who this Arthur was. Most of the room, however, barely noticed. The conversations continued, the chatter rising again to fill the space where the applause had been. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading and anticipating for weeks. He walked through the tables, feeling 100 pairs of indifferent eyes on him. He climbed the 3 steps onto the small stage and sat at the polished black piano. The lights were warm on his face. He could see the sea of faces, most of them turned away from him, absorbed in their own worlds. He was once again background. He placed his fingers on the keys, took a deep, shaky breath, and began. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant. They were a single, clear melody that hung in the air like a question. It was a strange, haunting sound that didn't quite fit the festive atmosphere of the room. It was like a thread of silver being pulled through a tapestry of noise. At first, it was just a distraction. A few people glanced toward the stage with annoyed expressions, as if a fly had buzzed near their ear. But the melody had a pull to it, a quiet insistence that was hard to ignore. It was full of a gentle, aching hopefulness that seemed to speak to something deep inside the listener. One by one, heads began to turn. The conversations at the tables closest to the stage started to die down. People who had been laughing loudly a moment before now found themselves listening, their faces unreadable. The music began to swell, growing more complex and layered. The hopeful melody was joined by a second, more melancholic line. It was the sound of loneliness, of routine, of a dream being slowly eroded by time. The music wasn't just sad. It was deeply, profoundly human. It was the sound of a Monday morning, of a long commute, of a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Now, the entire room was listening. The chatter had completely subsided. The clinking of glasses had stopped. All eyes were on the quiet man in the slightly too tight suit. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling a story. His eyes were closed, his body swaying slightly with the music. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace and power that seemed impossible for a man who usually just typed numbers. They were seeing him for the first time. Not Arthur from Data, not the quiet man in the corner. They were seeing the artist, the dreamer, the man who held a universe of emotion inside him. They were hearing the story of his life, and in it, they heard echoes of their own. The music built, layer by layer, growing in intensity and passion. The melancholic middle section began to give way to something else. A new melody started to emerge from the complex harmonies, a melody of defiance, of strength. It started quietly, a small voice of protest, but it grew louder and more powerful, rising up like a tide. It was the sound of a man finding his voice, of a spirit refusing to be broken. The music filled the ballroom, soaring and crashing like waves against a cliff. It was raw, it was powerful, and it was utterly captivating. He struck the final, resonant chord with a force that seemed to come from the very core of his being. The sound hung in the air, vibrating with an intensity that was almost physical. And then there was silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, charged silence, a moment of collective held breath. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, stunned, staring at the stage. For 5 full seconds, the room was completely, utterly still. It was in that silence that the transformation was complete. The joke was over. The pity was gone. All that was left was the raw, unvarnished truth of what they had just experienced. Then, a single person in the back started to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Then another person joined in. And another. Within seconds, the silence shattered. It wasn't just applause. It was an explosion. The entire room was on its feet, the sound thunderous, genuine, and reverent. It was a roar of appreciation, of awe, of apology. His colleagues stared with their mouths agape, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. His boss was frozen, his cocktail halfway to his lips, a look of profound astonishment on his face. In the back of the room, his wife was on her feet, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands clasped to her mouth. She was looking at him, not with worry, but with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. She was seeing her husband for the first time, not as a provider or a quiet hobbyist, but as the brilliant, passionate man she had married all those years ago. The real entertainment that followed felt hollow and cheap, a pale imitation of the real, human art they had just witnessed. Arthur had changed everything. The thunder of the applause was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over him and left him breathless. He remained on the bench, his fingers still resting on the keys, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment he was disconnected from it all, floating in the stunned silence that had preceded the roar and now in the deafening noise that followed. He saw the sea of faces all turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of awe, shock, and something that looked a lot like respect. It was a look he had never received before, not in this context, not from these people. Slowly, awkwardly, he stood up. The lights felt hotter now, the stares more intense. He gave a small, uncertain bow, a gesture that felt completely foreign to him, and walked off the stage. His wife was the first to reach him. She didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. He felt her shoulders shaking, and when she pulled back, he saw that her face was wet with tears. But these weren't tears of worry. They were tears of pure, unadulterated pride. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Arthur, I had no idea." He just shook his head, unable to find the words. He was as surprised as she was. Then came his colleagues, a small crowd forming around him. The loud salesman from marketing, the one who had drawn the picture of chopsticks, pushed his way to the front. His face was pale, and he looked genuinely humbled. "Man," he said, his voice barely audible, "I am so sorry. That was the most incredible thing I've ever heard. I'm an idiot." Arthur just looked at him, then gave a small, genuine nod. An apology wasn't necessary, but it felt like a cleansing rain. His boss came over, his usual worried expression replaced by one of complete astonishment. "Arthur," he said, his voice full of a new kind of reverence. I don't have the words. That was art? Pure art?" He clapped a hand on Arthur's shoulder, but this time it didn't feel condescending. It felt like an equal acknowledging another equal. The announcer, looking a bit flustered, tried to get the show back on track. "And, let's give another huge hand for Arthur," he said to another wave of applause. "Now, get ready to laugh with our very own funny man from marketing." The salesman walked onto the stage, but the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. The crowd was no longer a boisterous group ready for cheap laughs. They were a captive audience that had just experienced something profound. The salesman's jokes, which probably would have been fine an hour ago, now fell flat. They felt small and hollow. The audience was polite, but the spark was gone. They had been moved in a way they hadn't expected, and they couldn't just switch back to the usual office party nonsense. Arthur had, unintentionally, changed the entire tone of the evening. The car ride home was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, worried silence of the past. It was a comfortable, thoughtful silence. His wife drove, her hand steady on the wheel, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said, breaking the silence as they turned onto their street, "for years I've been worried about that piano. I saw it as a reminder of something you gave up, something that made you sad." She paused, pulling into their driveway. "But tonight I realized I was wrong. It's not a reminder of what you lost. It's who you are." She turned off the engine and looked at him, her eyes shining in the dim light from the porch. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." He reached over and took her hand. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not sure I saw it clearly either until tonight." The next morning he walked into the office, and it felt like stepping into a different dimension. The usual morning chatter died down as he passed, and heads turned. But it wasn't the awkward, mocking stares of the past. It was a quiet, respectful acknowledgement. People smiled at him, genuine smiles. As he walked to his desk, the young woman from marketing who had patted his arm and told him to play something relaxing stopped him. "Arthur," she said, her voice sincere, "I was just blown away. My daughter plays the piano, and she's been getting so frustrated. Do you think you could give me some advice for her? Just on how to keep her inspired?" It was such a simple question, but it was a question that valued his opinion, his art. It was a question that saw him as an expert, not a curiosity. "Of course," he said, a real smile spreading across his face. "Have her bring in some of her music sometime?" The biggest change came from his boss. An hour after he arrived, he got an email. "Arthur, can you come to my office?" He walked in, expecting the usual discussion about quarterly reports. But Mr. Davies wasn't behind his desk. He was standing by the window, looking out. "Arthur," he began, turning to face him. "What you did last night. It wasn't just music. It was about discipline, passion, a commitment to excellence. Those are the exact qualities we need more of in this company, not just in our reports, but in our thinking." He took a step closer. "We're starting a new initiative, a creative think tank to tackle some of our biggest challenges. We need people who can think outside the box, who aren't afraid to be bold. I want you to lead it." Arthur was stunned. He, a data analyst, was being asked to lead a creative team. It was an absurd, impossible idea, and yet, coming from his boss, it felt completely logical. I don't know anything about that," Arthur stammered. "You know about dedication?" his boss replied. "You know about turning something quiet into something powerful. That's all the knowledge you need." He didn't quit his job. He didn't suddenly become a world-famous concert pianist. Life didn't turn into a movie, but it did become richer, Fuller. He started the creative think tank and found he was actually quite good at it, applying the same methodical intensity he used for composing music to solving business problems. His colleagues no longer saw him as just Arthur from data. They saw him as a leader, a source of quiet inspiration. At home, the piano was moved from the corner of the living room to a place of honor. His wife would often sit in the evenings just listening, a cup of tea in her hands, a peaceful expression on her face. He started a small YouTube channel, just posting videos of himself playing Fading Echoes and other compositions. At first, there were only a few views, mostly from people at the office. But slowly the numbers grew. He would get comments from people all over the world, people who said his music had moved them, who had heard their own stories in his melodies. One evening, months after the gala, he was sitting at his piano, playing a new piece he was working on. The front door was open, letting in the cool evening air, and the sound of his music drifted out into the neighborhood. His daughter was home from college for a visit, and she was sitting on the couch, not on her phone, but just listening, her chin resting on her knees. He finished the piece, and the final chord faded into the twilight. He looked around at his life. He was still a data analyst, a husband, a father. He was still Arthur. But he was no longer a man divided. He was whole. The music wasn't a secret anymore. It was the sound of his life, a life that was finally, beautifully in harmony. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't just playing for an audience of 1 or 1,000. He was playing for himself, and that was more than enough.